Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 2. So now I want to get back to my last video and try to explain it. But first I just wanted to explain how I came across the scripture, because after I watched the video that I just showed in my last video, which I'll put the link in the description box as a review of that video, because I think it's a really important video to watch that confirms the 117 code and how God seems to be pointing to this year. And so after I watched that video, I had just put in the prophecy of Methuselah. I just wanted to confirm it, and I came up with this article by Chuck Missler, and I didn't really even read the article, I just kind of glanced at it, but this scripture right here obviously got my attention with the numbers 17 and 18, and he goes on to talk about how the names in the Bible tell the story, the genealogy of Jesus, and Methuselah is the name that means his death shall bring. And so one of the reasons why I was curious about the prophecy of Methuselah is because I realized that he was a type of Christ just from the number that he lived 969 years, which seems to be God's signature. It seems to be a demonstration of DNA, and I've talked about how God's name is associated with the numbers 9 and 6 and how that represents DNA, and that's something I've been wanting to talk more about, and so that's why I wanted to look into the prophecy. And then I came across this article by Chuck Missler, and that's when I noticed this scripture. Okay, so when I was looking for images of that scripture because I wanted to try to make a video about it, that's when I came across this image over here, and I watched a slideshow about it. And in the slideshow, it showed these other scriptures which talk about the end of the law, or the law coming to an end. And I noticed the same pattern that I've been talking about that's throughout the scriptures, from verses 14 to 17 particularly. It actually goes through to verse 18 as well. I've shown how it extends through to verse 18, especially in Ephesians 2, 14 through 18. Okay, you can see that here. I just put in Colossians 2, 14 to 18 to see if anything would come up, but instead it brought up Ephesians 2, 14 through 18. You can see there's a pattern with Hebrews 2, 14 through 18 that it's talking about here, but there's several in the scriptures. Okay, I'll show you another example that I've talked about in the scriptures that wasn't in the video, and that's in Genesis 49:10, where it talks about the prophecy of Shiloh, that Shiloh will not come until, it says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. And I've talked about how the scepter refers to DNA, that's what it's all ultimately talking about, especially here in verse 11, where it says, binding his foal unto the vine, and his ass's colt unto the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. But when you get to verse 14, it says, Issachar is a strong ass, couching between two burdens. Of course, over here it's talking about a male donkey and a female donkey, where it talks about binding his foal unto the vine, and this was a type and shadow of when Jesus rode in on a donkey, which was all a demonstration of DNA. And so Issachar here represents Christ, and the meaning of Issachar is there is recompense, and it says crouching between two sheepfolds. And when I looked up the word sheepfolds, or two burdens, when I looked up the word burdens, I saw that it means two sheepfolds, which is what Jesus did. He brought the two together. It's what Ephesians 2, 14 through 18 is talking about as well. And over here where it says couching down, that means to stretch oneself to lie down. And so, of course, Jesus died on the cross and was laid in the tomb. And this is how he reconciled the two sheepfolds, the Jews, which is represented by the Jews and the Gentiles, but it's a type and shadow of the DNA and the restoration of the DNA. Okay, and then it goes on through to verses 17 and 18, which I've talked about before, how Dan represents Jesus, but also represents the Antichrist. And then it culminates here with verse 18, where it says, I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. And so I've noticed this pattern throughout the scriptures, and this is the same pattern that you have with the blood moons, and it's also the pattern of the Passover week. So you have the 9th and the 10th, which would be when the perfect lamb was chosen during the Passover week. And of course this is a parallel to Yom Kippur, when the sacrifice is chosen as well. There's the scapegoat and the Azazel, the two goats, one that is chosen to be the sacrifice and the other one that escapes. And this begins on the night before, on the 9th of Tishri, and it's a parallel of the 10th of Nisan, when the perfect lamb is chosen, and then it's inspected for 4 days up until the 14th in the evening at twilight, between the evenings when the lamb is slain. So it was right between the 14th and the 15th, and this was a time that we had the blood moons in 2014 to 2015, and this is when the veil was rent when Jesus died on the cross. So this represents the division taking place here. That's why you have the Exodus in chapter 14 when the Red Sea is parted, and it's in Zechariah 14 when the Mount of Olives splits. It's all a representation of the DNA splitting and the restoration of the DNA when Jesus died on the cross. So you have the renting of the veil in the middle of the Passover week, and then 3.5 days later you have the resurrection, which was on the 18th, which was Sunday, and I've shown that it was actually the 18th, just before dawn, when Jesus rose from the dead. And so you have this blood moon pattern here that parallels the Passover week. Okay, so this is the same pattern that you have with the law ending. It just so happens to come up in Amos 8, talks about the end of the law, in 2 Corinthians 3, which makes the number 23 because it's all about DNA, from verses 17 to 18. In Ephesians, it's from verses 14 to 17, but it actually goes through to verse 18. Colossians 14 to 17, and then it's in Romans 7:7. Of course, it's the Hebrew year 77. So all of these talk about the end of the law, which matches up with when Jesus said, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. So you have the same pattern that was talked about in the slideshow that I found when I was just looking for images of that particular scripture. So it was in verses 17 through 18, and then it talks about whether there's a contradiction here, which of course there's no contradictions. It's just a matter of understanding what Jesus said. But then it shows the same pattern with all of these other scriptures. They all have the exact same pattern, and what I was showing here with Jeremiah 31 is how God is confirming the year that the Messiah was cut off. Jesus was cut off in 31 AD. That's when he made a new covenant. The word cut off in the scriptures is actually a word that means covenant. You can see that right here. It says, after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. It's the word karath, which means to cut off, but it also means to cut or make a covenant. And in most cases, when you look at the concordance, you see that it's talking about making a covenant. I've talked about this before, and it just so happens to be Strong's number 3772. Okay, and you see that God is confirming the year here as 31 AD when the Messiah was cut off. And so the second half of the 70th week, if there was no gap, would have been the years 31 through 34. So I believe those numbers represent the second half of Daniel's 70th week, and I'll show you that in Deuteronomy in a second. But over here in Jeremiah 31:31, this is talking about when Jesus made a new covenant when he died on the cross. But if you actually look at this word in the Greek, the way it's conjugated, where it says, behold, the days come when I will make a new covenant, in the Greek it actually says that I will be covenanted. And so this is also the fulfillment of the second half when the covenant is confirmed. But over here it says, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was a husband unto them, said the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. Okay, and it actually goes through to verse 34, because that would actually be the 3.5 years, so it goes halfway into this year, which would make the second half of Daniel's 70th week if there was no gap. And it says, and they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquity and will remember their sins no more. And so this is a culmination right here. Okay, so this matches up with Deuteronomy 31, because again over here God is talking about the 120 years. This is when Moses said, I am 120 years old this day. I can no more go out and come in. Also the Lord saith unto me, thou shalt not go over this Jordan. Okay, and then you see the 120 years mentioned again, starting in verse 7 when you go to Deuteronomy 34, because this is the 3.5 years later, and I've talked about how everything goes full circle in prophecy. Okay, I'll just show you that again real quick. You see that it's talking about the death of the two witnesses over here. It says, when they shall have finished their testimony, then the beast that comes out of the pit will overcome them and kill them. And so this is the 117 code, but this is at the end of the 3.5 years. And so everything goes full circle, and you see that again in Revelation 20 verse 7, which looks like 2017, and this is after the 1,000 years are expired when Satan is loosed out of the prison. So it goes right back to 2017, which is where we're at now. And then you have the Gog-Magog war mentioned next, which is what is about to begin, but it happens again in about 1,000 years. Okay, so you have the 120 years mentioned again here in verse 7, which is the second half of Daniel's 70th week, if there was no gap, from the years 31 AD to 34 AD. And it's in verses 7 and 8. And verse 8 is when the days of weeping for Moses are ended. And then Joshua takes over in verse 9. And of course, this is technically the 9th year on the Hebrew calendar, which seems to match up with the Jubilee. You see it mentioned here in verses 8 and 9. But then it talks about the Jubilee again, where it says, what shall we eat the 7th year? Behold, we shall not sow nor gather in our increase. Then I will command my blessing upon you in the 6th year, and it shall bring forth fruit for 3 years. You shall sow the 8th year, and eat yet of the old store until the 9th year, until her fruits come in. So God seems to be showing that there's 3 years involved with the Jubilee, extending through to the 9th year. Okay, once Joshua took over, it wasn't until the Passover that the Israelites crossed over the Jordan. You see that in Joshua 4:19. So I'm not sure if that's an indication that things might get extended through to the Passover, but even within the book of Joshua, there seems to be a pattern pointing to the years 17 and 18. You see it mentions victory here in Joshua 7 and 8. And of course, the inheritance was given in Joshua 18, but I'm out of time. Thanks for watching, and God